It seems to me very important, therefore, to then build our discussion about the ways in which African Americans resisted, American enslaved Africans, and resisted and survived in their own ways this systematic demolishing of their societies, their sense of social construction, the very systems that organize their societies in different parts of Africa. Slavery dismantled those, and slavery did so willfully. Slavery made every effort to remove concepts of leadership, except when leadership could serve the interests of the enslaver. Slavery created intertribal wars between Africans who were captured, and intentionally did so. Slavery the slave system sought to insult, to diminish, and to remove the use of languages by the Africans and the retaining of languages by the Africans for security reasons. As early as when they were enslaved and on the ships and being captured and put on the ships, as early as that point, there was a systematic and very carefully documented rules about how to create to sort of dismantle the possibilities of collusion among groups with similar languages because of the dangers, the mortal dangers that meant. Just to give you a sense, one of the fascinating pieces that exist from a wonderful series of letters and communication from a slave trader who was based in the UK, who financed the ships that went out and collected the slaves and, of course, brought them back, because this was massively lucrative. Some of the greatest wealth that Britons developed, especially in places like Bristol and Manchester, came through the trading of Africans. This was a source of great wealth. This was essentially the equivalent of, when in the 1990s we began to have the technological boom that will take place, Silicon Valley and so on and so forth, where wealth could be so rapidly created. As the novel Robinson Crusoe pointed out, is beautifully articulated novel by Daniel Defoe, he really uses details about what could be gained from being involved in the slave trade, and how much wealth, how much a fortune that could be won after two or three journeys to Africa and then to the New World. Just the significant amount of wealth. We also know that some of the great banks of the United Kingdom and now of the world had their start in the insuring of slave ships, insuring the enslaved, the slavers, because of course there was a concern that if the property that you had captured was to be destroyed, whether it's through storm or through disease, then one would have to insure each of them so that one could recoup the money from that insurance. So many of these banks and many of these insurance agencies developed, like Barclays Bank was one of those, and Lloyd's Bank, especially Lloyd's Bank, I think it was, and continues to be one of the great economic engines in Europe. Lloyd's Bank had their beginnings in the insuring of slavers, but so I think understanding the implications of that is important. And so what would happen is, once the slaves were picked up, the rule was they were instructed to be sure to move along the coast and not gather in too many enslaved people from the same spot. One of the reasons, of course, that they wanted to ensure was that the people who were being brought onto the ships would not all be able to speak the same language. They wanted just to have smaller groups from different parts of the coast of Africa, all the way from the Bight of Benin, from in terms of Nigeria, what is modern day Nigeria, and so forth, Senegal, Liberia, all of these places, all the way down to Angola. Slave ships would move from fortress to fortress or factory to factory. These were where the slaves were captured and brought to on the coast. And the idea was to mix it up. And if you mix it up, then it meant that the people who were on the ship could not communicate with each other in the same language, the enslaved people, the captured people, and which made it harder for them to have insurrections and rebellions on the ship. Now, there were many rebellions and insurrections on the ship. Many ships were even taken over. Of course, they didn't get far, and there was an incredible amount of violence to control that. But this was part of the systematic approach. And then when slaves were brought to the New World, they were discouraged from speaking the languages, the African languages, because it was deemed dangerous, because of course the enslaver could not understand them. And one of the worst things that could happen is if people are talking in a different language and conspiring, and you're not able to understand them, this could be a big problem. So it's a good place to then start thinking about this question of language and this question of understanding when we talk about something like the Negro spirituals. One of the interesting things is that the Negro spirituals are spirituals. They're spirituals that are predicated and understood around the idea of Christianity and so on. And in a sense, one of the key elements of the piety, the so-called piety of the Europeans who were enslaving Africans in America, was the idea that these people were doing so under the auspices of their Christian faith and with the humane view that they were going to bring these enslaved people to a knowledge of Christ, even though they would die slaves. But they would be brought to a knowledge of Christ, and this would be deemed more important than anything else that they could have, whether it's their freedom or the idea of their ability to stay in their homeland and so on. And so one of the things that would happen is that there was some instruction on Christianity. They were not taught, they were not encouraged to learn to read or write, but they were given instructions, and it was very, very limited and very, very calculated instruction for the enslaved people. The instructions tended to be those that endorsed the notion of slavery, at least in the ways that the scriptures were misinterpreted or misused, or in some instances were used. And it was to also create a system by which it was understood that their fealty, their loyalty to their owners, to their masters, so to speak, amounted to part of their Christian benefit, that this would be good for them. This is what would bring them to a sure salvation in God. This idea is fascinating. And of course, the concern would have been to say, well, why would the African people choose to accept this when it was obvious that this system was against them? But what we begin to see with the Negro spirituals is that the Africans had a very sophisticated way of engaging new philosophies and new thinkings that became part of their society. And in many instances, they were not as new as people had imagined. In other words, many African enslaved people were people who came with religion. They came with their own religions from their different parts of society, including religions that we would associate with North Africa and the Middle East, including Islam. And in some instances, many of the enslaved people who were brought from places like Angola came with Catholicism that they had encountered in the 1400s and the early 1500s, and that had developed into homegrown African belief systems as well. And so there's a way in which what Africans came in with them, the knowledge that they came with, was pretty sophisticated and pretty complex. And as many people would in new environments, new cultures, and new landscapes, they began to develop a belief system that would would meet the realities of the new landscape, and that would find an intellectual connection and a spiritual connection between where they were, what they brought to the space, all the different voices that became part of it. And so this is where the term syncretism began to come about. The syncretism was the genius and sophisticated ways in which African people would take belief systems and ideas that they encountered and that they also carried within themselves and formulate a new kind of spiritual understanding and a belief system that met their needs and that was liberatory to themselves. And this is hugely important. So when we talk about Afrocentric and African religions in the New World, whether it is the religion among the Gullah people in South Carolina and North Carolina, the Geechee Gullah people, whether it is hoodoo in places like Louisiana, or it is the Haitian voodoo, or it's Santeria from Cuba, it is Obia or Mayal, and other systems from the English-speaking Caribbean, especially from Jamaica, whether it's a spiritual Baptist in Trinidad and Tobago and other parts of the English-speaking Caribbean, or the grand system of Igbo and Yoruba belief systems that were dominant and still continue to be dominant in their existence, in their syncretistic expression in places like Brazil, in massive numbers. Whether it was that, there was this interesting way in which elements of Christianity, elements of Catholicism, and elements of African belief systems began to converge around a system that was liberatory, a system that was of survival, and a system that was promoting their own self-dignity. And in the African American experience, we tend to presume that even the ways in which Christianity was embraced happened to be just simply taking it lock, stock, and barrel and saying Christianity is what it is. But the Negro spirituals teach us something else. The Negro spirituals teach us that African Americans had done something quite radical to Christianity in their embrace of it as enslaved people. And what they had done was they had turned the ethical construction around Christianity into one that preserved, and not only preserved, but identified their own sense of dignity, in which they found affinity. They said that the true affinity of their existence and their understanding of who themselves might be, it was directly related to God. They were the God's chosen people. This is a fairly radical view because, of course, the enslaver considered themselves the chosen of God. They consider themselves the ones who would fall under the auspices of God's select people. And what African Americans began to do in their Negro spirituals was to turn that on its head and propose something else, but to do so in a manner that was full of subterfuge and a manner that would not even be understood necessarily and appreciated by the enslaver themselves. It's fascinating. So one of the interesting Negro spirituals, and it's worth just paying attention to at least one in this regard, would be "Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt land, tell old Pharaoh, let my people go." When Israel was in Egypt land, let my people go. They worked so hard they could not stand, let my people go. Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt land, tell old Pharaoh, let my people go. This is a very interesting song. And it's a song that follows exactly the narrative from Exodus, right? The narrative from Exodus of the enslavement of the Jewish people by the Egyptians and the 400 and odd years of their enslavement in Egypt. And then, of course, the Moses-led rebellion and escape that would take place by Moses confronting Pharaoh and saying, please let my people go. The song tells that story. Yet when an African American sings that song, you can then begin to see how their interpretation of typology was quite different from what might operate with the enslavers themselves. In other words, their typology created a radical aesthetics, a radical ethic, actually, a radical morality. And the radical morality was that my people, meaning God's people, were in fact the enslaved people. That is, the slaves who were living in the Americas today were singing, "Let my people go." They were saying, God is saying, let these people, we the enslaved people, go. And in that typology, Pharaoh represented the enslaver. Pharaoh represented the person who was enslaving them on their plantation. Pharaoh represented the people, the very people who claimed to be believers and Christians, but who were enslaving the African Americans. And in a sense, what they were doing was they were saying that we, the enslaved people, we, the oppressed and damaged, we are in fact God's true people. We are God's chosen people. And this was radically shifting the idea, the ethics, and the morality of what slavery represented. And so, in song after song, African Americans were taking Christianity and then presenting themselves as the true Christians, the true children of Israel, the true victimized that God would have mercy on, that God was on the side of. And in that act, they were enacting something that would continue as a core element of the movement towards freedom, the movement towards enfranchisement, the movement towards liberation, right up till to this day. In other words, if you think of what was happening during the civil rights movement, it was always still built on that very idea that God is on the side of the enslaved and the oppressed and against the enslaver and the oppressor. So, despite claims that African Americans who embraced Christianity were embracing Christianity as if they were embracing the belief of the belief system of their oppressor, in fact, what they were doing was radically shifting the ethic construction, the power dynamic within that belief system, and constructing a new one, and a new one that would become radically different and radically empowering and radically liberatory. And so in another Negro spiritual, it says, before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. O freedom, O freedom, O freedom over me. Before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. And this is again another radical articulation. It's a radical articulation because, of course, the worst thing that can happen to an enslaved person is their death for the enslaver, because of course that's the loss of property and that's the loss of land. And what when a Negro spiritual says, "Oh freedom, that it's articulating the desire to be free of slavery, to be free of enslavement. So, oh freedom over me, before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free." And there's a syncretism in that, because of course the invocation of a post life, a life after death, is an invocation of an ancestral sense. Fly away home to Zion, fly away home. One bright morning when my work is over, I will fly away home. Zion for the African, enslaved African, was not entirely the Zion that we would come to associate with heaven above, but the Zion that would mean a return back to the ancestral homeland, a return back to the land of their ancestors. This combination of ancestral belief systems working in tandem with this Christian idea of a God who is in protection of them, and a God who would exist for many of them. Nyakopon, Nyami, these are gods of West Africa who were seen as the sky god, the God above all God, and there were consistent ways in which these gelled with each other. So one of the things that we see in the Negro spirituals, and what I'm trying to get at in the Negro spirituals, is it creates a new aesthetic, a new poetics. And that poetics would continue to exist in African American writing. The ways in which people like James Weldon Johnson would talk about the spirituals, the way in which Langston Hughes would talk about the spirituals, the way in which so many writers would begin to talk about the radical and revolutionary name of the spirituals, and the ways in which the spirituals become a part of the literary understanding, but a literary understanding that is not necessarily one that embraces notions of Christianity as the purview or the ownership of white European belief systems, but a new kind of belief system that is fundamentally African, that is fundamentally resistant to the oppression of colonial society. So we'll stop there and pick this up at another time. Thank you.